The Seventh Crusade, the journey of St. Louis to the East in the mid-13th century, as Europe wavered between its internal conflicts and the dream of reclaiming the Holy Land, one of the last major attempts to impose Christian control over Jerusalem was launched. The Seventh Crusade, led by King Louis IX of France, was a bold adventure filled with religious and military ambition, but it ultimately turned into a human and political tragedy. Historical background: a world on the brink of a new crusade after the fall of Jerusalem to Saladin in 1187, the Europeans never ceased their attempts to retake the city. The Third Crusade failed to achieve this goal, despite the efforts of Richard the Lionheart and Frederick Barbarossa. Then came the Fourth Crusade, which deviated entirely from its path and sacked Christian Constantinople in 1204, weakening the Eastern Christian world. By the 13th century, Islamic forces, particularly the Ayyubids and later the Mamluks, had tightened their grip on the East. Meanwhile, Europe saw the rise of powerful kings like Louis IX, who viewed the crusade as both a religious duty and an opportunity to enhance his prestige. The king who wanted to be a St. Louis IX was born in 1214 and crowned King of France at the age of 12. Raised with deep religious devotion, he was known for his piety and just rule. By 1244, upon hearing the news of Jerusalem's fall once again to Muslim forces, after the Khwarezmian alliance with As-Salih Ayyub, he felt that God was calling him to lead a new crusade. His motivation was not purely political. Louis was convinced that liberating Jerusalem was the path to salvation. He consulted Pope Innocent IV, who blessed the campaign, and preparations began in earnest. Preparations for the crusade, a mighty army and vast funding. The Seventh Crusade was not merely a fleeting military adventure but a massive undertaking that required meticulous planning and vast resources. Louis IX raised enormous sums by imposing special taxes on the church and nobility. He also secured support from the Templars and Hospitallers, who were experts in Eastern warfare. Starting in 1245, fleets began gathering in French ports. The army consisted of thousands of knights and foot soldiers, along with craftsmen, doctors, and even noblewomen. In the spring of 1248, Louis set sail from the port of Aigues-Mortes in southern France, heading first to Cyprus, a crucial crusader base. Arrival in Cyprus, waiting and strategizing. The crusader fleet reached Cyprus in September 1248, where Louis decided to spend the winter organizing his forces and awaiting reinforcements. During this time, he sent envoys to the Mongols, hoping for an alliance against the Muslims, but these attempts failed. By the spring of 1249, the Crusader army was ready to move toward Egypt, which Louis saw as the key to controlling Jerusalem. Egypt was the heart of Islamic power, and its fall would strike the enemy at its core. The attack on Damietta, the first victory and false hopes. In June 1249, the Crusader fleet arrived on Egypt's shores and launched an assault on Damietta, the strategic port on the Nile. The city was well fortified, but the Crusaders captured it after a brief battle, as its defenders, led by Emir Fakhr ad-Din Yusuf, withdrew. The fall of Damietta shocked the Muslims, but the Crusaders failed to capitalize decisively on their victory. Instead of advancing swiftly toward Cairo, Louis chose to wait in Damietta for several months, awaiting reinforcements from France. This delay gave Sultan As-Salih Ayyub time to strengthen his defenses and rally his forces. The march toward Cairo, the beginning of disaster. By November 1249, Louis IX decided to march toward the Egyptian capital. However, the journey was far from easy. The Crusader army faced immense difficulties crossing the Nile's branches, while Mamluk forces launched repeated attacks on their rear. In December, Sultan As-Salih Ayyub died, but his wife, Shajar al-Dur, concealed his death to prevent political chaos. The Mamluk commander Baybars took charge of the army and began organizing strong defenses around the city of Mansurah. The Battle of Mansurah, a crushing defeat in February 1250, the Crusaders launched a major assault on Mansurah but fell into a well-laid ambush. The Mamluks led a fierce counterattack, resulting in the deaths of thousands of Crusaders, including the king's brother, Robert of Artois. Louis IX and his forces were besieged, and the army suffered from starvation and disease. By April 1250, the king was forced to surrender after a humiliating defeat. He and thousands of his soldiers were taken captive and subjected to harsh imprisonment, captivity and ransom. The end of the Crusader dream. Louis was compelled to negotiate the terms of his release. He agreed to pay an enormous ransom of 400,000 gold pieces and return Damietta to the Muslims. After paying part of the ransom, he was released in May 1250. However, Louis did not immediately return to France. Instead, he remained in the east for 4 more years, attempting to reinforce the Crusader presence in Acre and searching for a way to salvage what remained of the campaign. But the situation was hopeless, and in the end, he returned to France in 1254, leaving behind shattered dreams and thousands of dead. Aftermath and legacy. A harsh lesson in ambition and reality. The Seventh Crusade was a military and political disaster. It achieved none of its objectives and instead strengthened the Mamluks, who established a powerful state in Egypt and Syria. It also exposed the weakness of Crusader strategy, which relied on the leadership of a pious but inexperienced king in Eastern warfare. Despite his failure, Louis IX became a symbol of piety in Europe and was later canonized by the Catholic Church. In the Islamic world, this crusade reinforced the image of the Crusaders as defeated invaders and helped unite Muslims under the Mamluks, who ultimately ended the Crusader presence in the Levant after the fall of Acre in 1291. Thus, the Seventh Crusade became the final chapter in a 2-century-long saga, a saga that began with religious fervor and ended with the collapse of the dream to dominate the Holy Land in the mid-13th century AD, while Europe was embroiled in its internal conflicts and groping its way between the ruins of ancient empires and the emergence of new kingdoms. The figure of King Louis IX of France emerged from the mists of history. This young king took upon himself the burden of a crusading dream that had remained unfulfilled for decades. The Seventh Crusade he led in 1248 AD marked a pivotal moment in the history of East-West conflict, a late chapter in that long struggle which had begun a century and a half earlier. The Islamic world at that time was undergoing radical transformations. While the Ayyubid state in Egypt and Syria suffered from internal weakness and power struggles, a new force was appearing on the horizon, the Mamluks, who would later seize control. In Europe, the Catholic Church was struggling to maintain its spiritual unity against cracks beginning to appear in its ancient walls. King Louis IX's decision to launch a new crusade did not emerge from a vacuum, but was the result of historical accumulations and contemporary circumstances. After Jerusalem fell again into Muslim hands in 1244 AD to the Khwarezmians, this event shook the conscience of the Christian world. News reached Europe on the wings of merchants and pilgrims, telling of terrible massacres in the Holy City, destroyed churches, and desecrated Christian images. All this ignited the fire of religious zeal in the hearts of Western Christians. The young Louis IX, raised in piety and devotion, saw himself as a defender of the faith and leader of Christendom. His intention was not merely to recapture a city or achieve a military victory, but his vision went much deeper. He imagined himself as the liberator of holy places, the restorer of the Crusader kingdom that had begun to crumble in the East. His personality was a strange mixture of mysticism and political action, of royal asceticism and determination to fulfill God's will as he understood it. Preparations for the crusade in France took unprecedented dimensions. The king ordered special taxes to be collected from the church and nobility, summoning the best military leaders and war experts. The royal treasuries overflowed with money collected from across the kingdom, while shipyards in southern French ports buzzed with workers building a massive fleet to transport armies across the Mediterranean. This was not merely a passing army, but the journey of an entire people. Joining the ranks of soldiers were monks, craftsmen, merchants, doctors, and even women from noble families. Everyone believed they were about to participate in a great historical event, in a decisive battle between good and evil, between the light of Christianity and the darkness of Islam as they imagined it. When the Crusader fleet sailed from the port of Aigues-Mortes in southern France in the summer of 1248 AD, emotions were mixed between religious zeal and fear of the unknown. The ships carried thousands of heavily armed soldiers, hundreds of horses, weapons and ammunition stores, and everything needed to wage a long war in distant lands. Their first destination was the island of Cyprus, that Crusader stronghold in the eastern Mediterranean, which would serve as their launching base toward Egypt. The Crusader army remained in Cyprus for several months, during which Louis IX attempted to strengthen his alliances. He sent envoys to the Mongols in the east, hoping to find allies against the Muslims, but these attempts failed. Meanwhile, Sultan as-Salih Ayyub in Egypt was preparing to face the coming storm, aware that this time the Crusaders would not attack Palestine directly, but would seek to strike the heart of the Islamic world in Egypt. In June 1249 AD, the decisive phase of the crusade began. The Crusader fleet crossed the sea from Cyprus to the Egyptian coast, anchoring before the city of Damietta, that strategic port at the mouth of the Nile River. The first battle was short and decisive, with the Crusaders capturing the city after limited resistance. But this initial success was the beginning of the end, as the Crusaders showed unprecedented hesitation in advancing into the Egyptian interior, giving their enemies ample time to reorganize. Louis IX and his army remained in Damietta for several months, awaiting additional reinforcements from France. This mistaken military decision became the turning point in the Crusades' progress. During this time, the Mamluks in Egypt were preparing to face the invaders, benefiting from their deep knowledge of the battlefield and their meticulous military organization. When the Crusaders finally decided to advance toward Cairo in November 1249 AD, the Islamic forces had prepared a perfect trap for them. The Crusader army marched along the Nile banks, suffering from desert heat and rough terrain, while Mamluk forces constantly harassed them. News reached the Crusaders of Sultan as-Salih Ayyub's death, but his wife Shajar al-Dur concealed the news and wisely managed the state to avoid weakening the soldiers' morale. The Battle of Mansurah in February 1250 AD was the decisive blow to the Seventh Crusade. The Crusaders fell into a carefully prepared ambush by Mamluk leaders, with thousands killed including the king's brother Robert of Artois. Louis IX was besieged with the remnants of his army, all suffering from hunger and disease. Finally, the king was forced to surrender in April 1250 AD, captured along with many of his soldiers. The French king became a legend in Europe as a prisoner, while becoming a bargaining chip in the hands of the Muslim victors. After bitter negotiations, he agreed to pay an enormous ransom and surrender Damietta in exchange for his release. But Louis, in his peculiar way, did not immediately return to France after his release, instead remaining in the East for 4 more years, trying in vain to salvage what could be saved of the Crusader presence in Acre. When Louis finally returned to France in 1254 AD, he had lost 2/3 of his army, and with them his dreams of liberating Jerusalem. Strangely, this crushing failure did not weaken his image in Europe. On the contrary, it turned him into an icon of piety and perseverance. After his death, the Church declared him a saint, while his failed crusade remained an eloquent lesson in the dangers of ill-calculated military adventures. In the Islamic world, the results of the Seventh Crusade strengthened the position of the Mamluks, who soon after established a powerful state in Egypt and Syria. This crusade was the last major attempt to recover the Holy Land, as the Eighth Crusade led by Louis himself later in 1270 AD was but a faint echo of a crusading dream that had already ended. Thus, the Seventh Crusade remains a stark model of the gap between grand religious ambitions and the possibilities of their realization on the ground. It was the adventure of a pious king who wanted to be both saint and warrior, but turned into a human tragedy that revealed the limitations of European power against the rise of new Islamic forces. The bells of churches across Europe rang out when news arrived of the fall of Damietta, that fortified city at the mouth of the Nile, into the hands of the Crusaders led by Louis IX. Ships arriving from the east carried reports of this early victory, sending monks and priests into massive processions, chanting hymns of thanksgiving through the streets of Paris, London, and Rome. In public squares, people whispered that a miracle had finally occurred after years of successive Crusader failures. In noble palaces, princes and barons began preparing to travel east, imagining the road to Jerusalem now lay open before them. A Templar knight wrote to his comrades in Europe describing the first moments after the conquest. When we raised the cross above Damietta's walls, soldiers wept with joy, and we all believed we were about to restore the glory of Godfrey of Bouillon. To them, Damietta was not just a city, but the gateway that would inevitably lead to the recovery of the entire Holy Land. Yet behind these public displays of joy, wiser voices whispered warnings. In a remote Norman monastery, an elderly monk wrote in his chronicle, "I have seen this before, an early victory followed by disaster." He referred to the Fifth Crusade 30 years earlier, when Damietta had similarly fallen only for victory to turn into humiliating defeat. In Constantinople, Emperor Palaiologos watched events cautiously, telling his advisors, "The French are dancing now, but Egypt is not as easy as they imagine." Among experienced military circles, some commanders noted that the manner of the city's capture contained ominous signs. The Muslim defenders had withdrawn in an orderly fashion, as if drawing the crusaders into a carefully laid trap. A Teutonic knight commander wrote to Germany, "The city fell with suspicious ease. This is not victory, but the beginning of a test." While Europeans celebrated, Islamic forces prepared their response. In Cairo, where Sultan as-Salih Ayyub lay dying, he gathered his commanders and instructed them, "Let them celebrate now, we shall make Damietta their grave." The Mamluks began reorganizing, benefiting from time wasted by crusaders reveling rather than advancing toward Cairo. Every hour Louis IX spent in Damietta gave his enemies precious time to regroup. In the merchant markets of Venice and Genoa, astute traders carefully calculated their positions. Prices for spices and Eastern goods skyrocketed wildly, while some began hiding their wares in anticipation of troubled times. An Italian merchant recorded, "Everyone speaks of victory, but I'm buying weapons, the real war hasn't begun yet." Even among common people, doubts began creeping in after the first weeks of celebration. Why had no further news arrived of Crusader advances? Why did King Louis remain so long in Damietta? Questions accumulated in people's minds with each passing day lacking news of fresh victories. Within the Catholic Church, Pope Innocent IV attempted to temper excessive enthusiasm. Unlike the masses, he understood the campaign remained in its early stages. In a secret letter to Louis, he wrote, "Beware of overconfidence. Damietta is merely a first step." Yet not even the Pope could imagine the disaster awaiting the Crusaders at Mansurah. When news of the catastrophe finally reached Europe months later, joy turned first to shock, then to profound grief. Damietta became a bitter memory, a harsh lesson in the dangers of premature celebration. That city where victory banners had flown above its walls transformed into a symbol of wasted opportunity, of the Crusader dream shattered once more against the rocks of reality. Ultimately, Europe's response to Damietta's fall revealed profound truths about the Crusader mentality of the mid-13th century. They remained prisoners of the old dream, unable to comprehend the geopolitical complexities of the East. Damietta became a mirror reflecting all the contradictions of that era: deep faith and political ambition, religious fervor and worldly calculations, grand dreams and bitter failures. The city's story exposed the dangerous gap between romantic religious ideals and the harsh realities of holy war, between what Christendom imagined and what it could actually achieve in distant lands. The crushing defeat of the Seventh Crusade left deep scars on the body of Christendom, marking a dangerous turning point in the conflict between East and West. When King Louis IX returned to France in 1254 after 4 years of captivity and humiliation, he did not return alone. He carried with him the corpses of Europe's grand dreams of dominating the Levant. What had begun as a campaign of great momentum and even greater hopes had transformed into a nightmare that tore apart Crusader armies and cast long shadows over the future of holy wars. In the palaces of Paris, where victory banners had once flown, a heavy silence now reigned. The king who had departed years earlier amidst cheering crowds now returned behind closed doors, his eyes bearing a despair the French people had never before witnessed. The royal treasury stood depleted, armies destroyed, confidence in leadership shaken. In the streets, people began asking, how can we trust leaders who presented defeat as victory? How could a sacred cause end in such catastrophic failure? In Egypt and Syria, the scene differed entirely. Islamic cities buzzed with joy, mosques filled with worshippers giving thanks for the great victory. The Mamluks had proven themselves the new invincible force, the true guardians of the Islamic world. In Cairo, where the new Sultan al-Din Aibak was celebrating his victories, a new idea took root. Times had changed, the era of defeats had ended. The Battle of Mansurah had transformed the Mamluks from mere slaves into masters of a nation's destiny. Economically, the losses proved devastating. Ships sunk in the Nile, horses perished in the desert, weapons turned into enemy spoils, all dealt a crushing blow to the European economy. Italian merchants in Venice and Genoa, who had dreamed of new trade routes, found themselves facing a bitter reality. The doors to the east had closed more firmly than ever before. In religious circles, anxiety began to spread. Pope Innocent IV, who had blessed and fully supported the campaign, found himself in an awkward position. How to explain the defeat of what was considered the strongest, most organized Crusader army? Where was the divine will he had promised? Questions began circulating in church circles, even reaching common folk militarily. The disaster proved comprehensive. Not merely a lost battle, but the collapse of the idea of an invincible crusader army. Failed tactics, faulty intelligence, hesitant leadership all became subjects of study and analysis in Arab military schools, while haunting the nightmares of European commanders. In the Islamic world, the impact differed completely. The battle birthed a new generation of military leaders, proving that Islamic unity could repel even the mightiest invaders. The Mamluks began thinking not just of defense, but of offense, reclaiming all the crusaders had taken. A new spirit animated the nation, declaring, "The time of weakness has ended, the era of strength has begun." Culturally and intellectually, the defeat shocked European thought. How could a civilization considering itself representative of true religion and culture be so thoroughly defeated? Some European thinkers began questioning, are we truly right? Is this really God's will? Meanwhile, the Islamic world grew more confident in its path and prouder of its identity. The East-West relations entered a new phase of tension. No longer the superficial interactions of relatively peaceful times, they became marked by suspicion and hostility. Merchants who had served as bridges between civilizations found themselves under surveillance. Cultural exchange that had been growing suddenly halted. In European halls of power, politicians began thinking differently. Crusades no longer represented that glorious project enjoying universal support, but rather a perilous adventure. Kings who had once competed to join holy wars now sought excuses to remain home. In the East, a new era dawned, one where crusaders ceased being active participants, becoming mere historical remnants struggling to preserve what little remained. Crusader cities in the Levant began sensing the approaching danger, their inevitable demise. All understood the equation had changed, the balance had permanently tipped in favor of the Islamic world. The lesson proved harsh but necessary. History had again demonstrated that military strength alone suffices not, that blind faith in superiority guarantees no victory, that nations united in purpose can work miracles. The Seventh Crusade represented Europe's last major attempt to alter the Eastern balance of power, yet ended by confirming that balance, this time in the East's favor. Ultimately, this was no mere passing military defeat, but the end of an entire era, one where Europe believed it could impose its will on the East. But the East, with its renewed strength, revitalized faith, and conscious leadership, had decided to write a new chapter in its history, one where crusaders would have no place. The Seventh Crusade's failure reshaped medieval geopolitics, proving that even the most meticulously planned campaigns could founder against determined resistance and shifting historical tides. Its legacy endured not in territorial gains but in hard-won lessons about the limits of holy war and the resilience of civilizations under threat. Al-Malik al-Salih Najm al-Din Ayyub, that aging Ayyubid sultan who shouldered the burden of confronting the most formidable crusader campaign the East had seen since Saladin's time, became the master of events. Though illness confined him in his final days, his penetrating vision and wise management of the conflict proved decisive in shattering Louis IX's ambitious dreams. Fate had chosen this man, who spent his life in internal struggles with his Ayyubid kinsmen, to become the stumbling block before the Crusaders' last serious attempt to restore the glory of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. In those critical days of 1249, as the massive Crusader fleet approached Egypt's shores, Al-Salih Ayyub sat in his Mansurah palace, his frail body belying his steely will. Through spies scattered across Mediterranean ports, he had learned of the coming storm and prepared with remarkable wisdom. He knew an open battle against the Crusaders would be suicidal, for his army was outnumbered and outgunned by those steel-clad hordes from Europe. Yet he transformed weaknesses into strengths, turning his own terrain into an ally. Damietta, that fortified city at the Nile's mouth, stood as the Crusaders' first target. Al-Salih fortified it strongly, provisioning it for prolonged siege. But he issued surprising orders that astonished his commanders: let them enter Damietta, then withdraw in orderly fashion. He sought to make the city a trap, luring the Crusaders inland, away from their ships and supplies. This bold, dangerous plan later proved brilliantly ingenious. When the Crusaders entered Damietta in June 1249, they found it nearly empty. Initially believing they'd achieved easy victory, they soon discovered their entrapment. Problems multiplied, the surrounding marshes bred disease, supplies lagged, inland routes bristled with danger, all part of al-Salih's meticulous design. From his sickbed in Cairo, the ailing sultan directed the campaign. He ordered crops burned in all areas the crusaders might traverse, turning Egypt's fertile countryside into barren land offering no provisions. He oversaw construction of new barriers and forts at Mansurah, exploiting the delta's complex waterways and narrow bridges that would hinder heavy crusader cavalry. But al-Salih's greatest achievement lay in building and training the Mamluk army. Years earlier, he'd recognized traditional armies couldn't withstand crusaders, so he purchased multitudes of young Turkish and Circassian Mamluks, training them ruthlessly in special camps on Rada Island. These Mamluks, under leaders like Baybars and Aybak, would later become instruments of the Crusaders' crushing defeat at Mansurah. Al-Salih knew time favored him. Each day the Crusaders remained stuck in Damietta sapped their strength and morale. Meanwhile, he exploited this precious time to strengthen defenses and organize his army. He prevented internal rebellion with an iron fist. Some historians recount he executed potentially disloyal emirs during this critical period. When the Crusaders finally began their sluggish advance toward Cairo in November 1249, all preparations stood complete. The road to Mansurah became their living hell, waterways obstructing progress, daily skirmishes by hit-and-run Mamluk light cavalry, supply shortages, and rampant disease, all parts of al-Salih's plan to weaken the enemy before decisive engagement. But fate had other plans. In November 1249, al-Salih died in his Mansurah palace. Under normal circumstances, this should have collapsed the Islamic front. Yet the Sultan had prepared for everything. His wife Shujar al-Dir concealed his death for weeks, continuing to issue orders in his name. Mamluk commanders like Baybars meticulously executed his strategy. When the decisive battle came in February 1250, every element al-Salih had prepared fell into place. The Mamluks he'd trained, the defenses he'd built, the tactics he'd devised all combined to crush the Crusader army in one of the most humiliating defeats of the Crusades. The Mansurah victory crowned al-Salih's strategic vision. Though he didn't live to see his troops triumph, every component derived from his planning. He transformed Egypt from vulnerable target into what historians later called the Crusaders' graveyard. He defeated not just their armies but shattered their morale and dreams forever. This campaign, begun with such momentum, became a nightmare thanks to that aging sultan who saw what others couldn't and prepared as none other had. The Seventh Crusade marked a decisive turning point in the long history of the Crusades that spanned over 2 centuries. Led by King Louis IX of France between 1248 and 1254, this campaign represented the final chapter in the bloody conflict between East and West, a chapter that closed the era of major Crusader expeditions and ushered in a new phase of relations between the Islamic and Christian worlds. When the massive French fleet set sail from the port of Aigues-Mortes, the idea of crusading had already begun losing its luster in Europe. More than 150 years had passed since the success of the First Crusade in capturing Jerusalem and establishing a Latin kingdom in the East, but the grand dreams of the early Crusaders had shattered against harsh realities. A series of defeats and alternating victories, from Saladin's recapture of Jerusalem to Frederick II's temporary recovery of the city, had painted a complex picture of a conflict that no longer carried the religious and emotional momentum of its early days. King Louis IX, the young devout monarch raised on tales of the First Crusaders' heroism, took upon himself the mission of reviving this ancient dream. Louis was not merely a king seeking military glory, but a man deeply convinced that liberating the Holy Land was a sacred religious duty. He saw himself as heir to the kings of Scripture and leader of Christendom in its decisive battle against Islam. His vision transcended politics and diplomacy, entering the realm of spirituality and faith, giving his campaign a different character from previous ones. The preparations were enormous by any measure. Louis gathered around him an elite corps of French knights and nobles, while amassing tremendous financial resources through special taxes levied on the church and bishops. This was the first crusade led by what could be considered a modern nation-state of that era, rather than just a random alliance of knights and adventurers as had often been the case in previous campaigns. The fleet that sailed from France was the largest in decades, carrying thousands of trained soldiers, hundreds of horses, and the most advanced weapons known to Europe at the time. But the Islamic world they were heading toward was not the same one encountered by the First Crusaders. The balance of power had radically changed. The Ayyubid dynasty founded by Saladin was experiencing internal crises, while a new force loomed on the horizon, the Mamluks. These fierce warriors, raised in specialized military schools, were about to change the course of history. Al-Salih Ayyub, the Ayyubid sultan ruling Egypt at that time, had increasingly relied on them in his army, recognizing they represented the military future of the Islamic world. When the Crusaders reached Damietta in June 1249, it seemed history was repeating itself. The fortified city that had been the target of the Fifth Crusade 30 years earlier fell this time with astonishing speed. But this ease was actually part of Al-Salih Ayyub's meticulous plan. He left the city nearly empty to lure the Crusaders inland, away from their ships and supply bases. This clever strategy marked the beginning of the end for the Seventh Crusade. The months the Crusaders spent in Damietta were enough to exhaust their forces and weaken morale. Diseases spread among the soldiers, supplies began running low, and the hot weather took its toll on Europeans unaccustomed to Egypt's climate. Meanwhile, the Mamluks were preparing for the decisive confrontation under new leaders like Baybars, who would later become one of the greatest Mamluk sultans. When Louis IX finally decided to advance toward Cairo in November 1249, disaster awaited him. The road to the Egyptian capital became a living hell for the Crusaders. Waterways and marshes hindered their progress, while daily skirmishes by light Mamluk cavalry drained their strength. When they finally reached Mansurah in February 1250, crushing defeat awaited them. The Mamluks annihilated the Crusader army in one of the bloodiest battles of Crusader history. Thousands were killed or captured, including King Louis himself, who found himself a prisoner in the very fortress he had hoped to conquer. This defeat was not merely a passing military setback, but a sign of an entire era's end. It proved that the regional balance of power had irreversibly changed. The victorious Mamluks were not just strong warriors, but represented a new military and political system capable of facing the most serious challenges. Louis IX's return to France in 1254 marked the end of the Seventh Crusade, but also signaled the beginning of the end for the Crusader presence in the East generally. In subsequent decades, the Mamluks would rule Egypt and Syria with an iron grip, and the last Crusader stronghold at Acre would fall in 1291. Closing one of the longest chapters in East-West conflict history. But the legacy of the Seventh Crusade extended beyond military aspects. It left profound impacts on political, cultural, and religious levels for both sides. In Europe, the defeat led to a radical re-evaluation of the very idea of crusading. Crusades no longer represented that glorious project with universal support, but became risky adventures. Kings and princes who once competed to join holy wars now preferred staying home to tend to domestic affairs, i.e. in the Islamic world, victory boosted self-confidence and pride in identity. Muslims saw their triumph over the Seventh Crusade as confirmation of their faith's strength and truth. The Mamluks who led the battle became national heroes, symbols of a new Islamic power capable of defending Dar al-Islam from any external aggression. On a strategic level, the Seventh Crusade revealed deep shifts in the conflict's nature. Battles were no longer limited to direct confrontations between armies, but became wars of attrition relying on logistical superiority and deep knowledge of geography and climate. The Mamluks understood these realities and exploited them brilliantly, while the Crusaders remained prisoners of outdated traditional tactics. The campaign's economic consequences were equally far-reaching. The enormous material losses France suffered in financing the crusade and paying the huge ransom for their captive king negatively impacted the European economy for years. Meanwhile, the Mamluk victory strengthened Egypt's position as a key economic center in the region, paving the way for new commercial prosperity in the Islamic world. Culturally and intellectually, the Seventh Crusade was a defining moment in shaping mutual stereotypes between East and West. Crusaders returning to Europe brought stories of Mamluk strength and ferocity in battle, contributing to the image of the mysterious and dangerous East in the European imagination. Conversely, Muslims reinforced their view of Europeans as foreign invaders hostile to Islam. Ultimately, the Seventh Crusade represented the end of the Grand Crusader dream in the East. It was Europe's last serious, organized attempt to alter the regional balance of power by military force. Thereafter, Crusades became limited projects, or even pretexts for narrow political goals. The world was changing, power balances were shifting, and the Crusades in their classical form were becoming part of the past. Perhaps the most important lesson of the Seventh Crusade was that military power alone cannot achieve lasting victory. The Mamluks understood this truth and built their state on solid foundations of national unity, administrative competence, and military superiority. The Crusaders remained prisoners of internal divisions and narrow visions that prevented them from realizing their grand dreams. This fundamental difference determined the fate of the Seventh Crusade, and ultimately the fate of the Crusades as a whole. The Seventh Crusade witnessed a series of decisive battles that altered the course of history, not merely conventional military confrontations, but clashes between competing worldviews, opposing strategies, and unyielding wills. Each battle represented a chapter in a grand human epic, a tale of victories and defeats, sacrifices and betrayals, wisdom and folly. In June 1249, the Crusader army under King Louis IX stood before the fortified gates of Damietta, the strategic city at the Nile Delta's mouth. Damietta had long been the key to Egypt and a primary target for previous crusades. Yet this time, circumstances differed profoundly. Sultan As-Salih Ayyub, that cunning Ayyubid ruler, had devised an ingenious plan. Rather than mounting a desperate defense, he ordered his forces to withdraw methodically, leaving the Crusaders a nearly empty city. His intent was to lure them inland, away from their ships and supply lines, into territory where he could dictate their fate. King Louis IX, entering the city in triumph, found himself in an unusual predicament. Victory had come too easily, leaving him with hollow conquest. Damietta's rapid fall became the Crusaders' trap. As weeks turned to months, the mighty Crusader army remained confined within the city walls while disease ravaged the soldiers, supplies dwindled, and the oppressive heat became unbearable. Meanwhile, the Mamluks prepared for decisive confrontation, using each passing day to strengthen defenses and train their forces. After 6 months of occupation, Louis finally decided to advance toward Cairo. Though weary and diseased, his army still clung to hopes of victory. Their first true test came at the Battle of Ferriscour in August 1249, a prelude of what awaited them. The Mamluks employed guerrilla tactics, striking then withdrawing, leveraging their intimate knowledge of the terrain. Though the Crusaders forced Mamluk retreat, they recognized they faced an adversary unlike any before. The defining battle, however, awaited at Mansurah. By February 1250, the exhausted Crusader force reached this city, the Ayyubid winter capital. Here, within these walls transformed into an impregnable fortress, the young Mamluk commander Baybars had prepared an inescapable trap. The Battle of Mansurah became an epic of suffering and bloodshed. Crusaders led by Robert of Artois, the king's brother, entered the city with overconfidence only to find themselves trapped in a maze of narrow alleys where Mamluks ambushed them at every turn. Waterways turned the battlefield into a deadly snare, and heavily armored knights found maneuvering impossible. Robert himself perished in the fighting, while thousands of Crusader corpses littered the streets. Following this disaster, the remnants of the Crusader army attempted retreat, but the Mamluks pursued mercilessly. At the Battle of Al-Bar, they destroyed the sole bridge across which the Crusaders could escape, trapping King Louis and his surviving forces. On April 6, 1250, Louis was compelled to surrender, becoming prisoner to those he had hoped to conquer. The final chapter of this tragedy unfolded back in Damietta itself, where everything had begun. After Louis's release in exchange for an enormous ransom and surrender of Damietta, the Mamluks besieged and recaptured the city by August 1250, ending forever the Crusader presence in Egypt. These battles, from Damietta to Mansurah, transcended mere military engagements. They became historical turning points. The Battle of Mansurah in particular entered military annals as a textbook example of how a smaller, well-trained force could defeat a larger, better-equipped army through superior terrain use and tactical brilliance. For the Crusaders, the campaign served as a harsh lesson in the perils of hubris and miscalculation. The strategic consequences proved profound. The Mamluks established themselves as the region's new power, demonstrating Egypt was no longer vulnerable to invasion. The Crusaders emerged from this experience with shattered confidence in their ability to achieve decisive victories in the East. The grand crusading vision began dissolving, and the regional balance of power shifted irrevocably. These battles marked not just the Seventh Crusade's failure, but the beginning of the end for the entire Crusader enterprise in the Holy Land. The Mamluk forces demonstrated military brilliance in their decisive defeat of the Seventh Crusade, employing a multi-layered strategy that combined tactical innovation with psychological warfare and deep understanding of their home terrain. These slave warriors turned masters of war transformed Egypt into an impenetrable fortress through their calculated approach, beginning with their deliberate abandonment of Damietta in June 1249, not from weakness, but as part of a sophisticated trap to draw the overconfident Crusaders inland away from their naval support and into unfamiliar territory. As King Louis IX forces occupied Damietta for 6 critical months, the Mamluks under Sultan al-Salih Ayyub and his commanders like Baybars used this time to perfect their defenses, converting the entire Nile Delta into a killing zone. They implemented a scorched earth policy, burning crops and poisoning wells along the Crusaders' projected path to Cairo, while simultaneously reinforcing Mansurah's defenses with an intricate network of trenches, barricades, and hidden troop positions that would prove devastatingly effective. The Mamluk military machine operated with precision, their light cavalry conducting relentless hit-and-run attacks that kept the Europeans in constant tension while their main forces remained fresh for the decisive confrontation. When the Crusaders finally advanced toward Mansurah in February 1250, they entered a meticulously prepared death trap. The Mamluks had transformed the city's narrow streets and waterways into a labyrinth of death, channeling the heavily armored European knights into kill zones where they could be systematically butchered. The legendary Mamluk commander Baybars demonstrated his tactical genius during these engagements, first allowing a contingent of Crusaders to penetrate deep into the city before springing the trap. His forces emerged from hidden positions to surround and annihilate the invaders, including the slaughter of Robert of Artois and his elite knights in one of the Crusades' most devastating single engagements. The Mamluks' mastery of the Nile Delta's waterways proved equally crucial to their victory. By controlling all river crossings and strategically destroying the bridge at Al-Bahr as-Sagar, they completely entrapped the retreating Crusader army, leaving them exhausted and starving on the riverbanks. This logistical stranglehold, combined with their psychological warfare tactics, including night raids and the concealment of Sultan al-Salih's death to maintain morale, broke the Crusaders' fighting spirit completely. Perhaps most impressively, the Mamluks adapted their traditional steppe warfare tactics perfectly to the Egyptian environment. Their horse archers, trained on the Central Asian plains, became equally lethal fighting from small boats on the Nile's tributaries. Their mobility allowed them to strike anywhere along the Crusaders' extended column, while their intimate knowledge of local conditions turned every marsh and irrigation canal into an ally against the invaders. The final Mamluk triumph came through their diplomatic and strategic acumen after the Battle of Mansurah. Rather than simply slaughtering the captured Louis IX, they negotiated a devastatingly favorable settlement, extracting an enormous ransom, the return of Damietta, and lasting psychological damage to Crusader morale across Europe. This comprehensive victory didn't just defeat a single crusade, it fundamentally altered the balance of power in the eastern Mediterranean, establishing the Mamluks as the dominant regional force and effectively ending European hopes of conquering Egypt or Jerusalem through military means. Their success stemmed not from superior numbers or equipment, but from superior understanding of warfare's evolving nature in the 13th century Mediterranean world. The Seventh Crusade stands as one of the most meticulously organized and well-funded military campaigns in Crusader history, yet it culminated in an unmitigated disaster. This catastrophic failure did not emerge from a vacuum but resulted from an interconnected web of strategic, tactical, and logistical factors that unfolded during its long journey from France to Egypt. At the heart of this failure lies a tale of flawed planning and overconfidence. King Louis IX, the devout monarch who led the crusade with genuine religious intentions, fell victim to military hubris. He gravely underestimated his Mamluk adversaries, those formidable warriors forged in specialized military schools. The Crusaders believed they were confronting a fragmented Islamic force as in previous encounters, only to collide with a new reality, a highly disciplined army led by brilliant commanders like Baybars. The first strategic blunder manifested clearly at Damietta. The city that fell into their hands with surprising ease in June 1249 transformed from a military triumph into a deadly trap. Instead of advancing swiftly toward Cairo, the Crusaders squandered 6 precious months in the city, their forces gradually weakening from disease and supply shortages. Each day spent in Damietta became a priceless gift to the Mamluks, who exploited this period to reinforce their defenses and prepare their ambushes. When Louis finally decided to march toward Cairo in November 1249, he had chosen the worst possible time for advancement. Winter in the Nile Delta meant flooded terrain that transformed routes into impassable swamps, severely hindering the heavy Crusader forces. The armored knights found themselves immobilized in these conditions, while the lightly equipped Mamluks moved effortlessly through familiar waterways. Mamluk tactical superiority became glaringly evident during the decisive Battle of Mansurah in February 1250. Crusader commanders, particularly the king's brother Robert of Artois, led a reckless assault on the city without proper reconnaissance. They entered like rats into a trap, finding themselves ensnared in a maze of narrow alleys and pre-prepared barricades. The network of canals turned the battlefield into a killing zone where heavily armored Crusader knights became immobilized targets for Mamluk archers striking from all directions. Logistical failures proved equally decisive. As the Crusaders advanced inland, their supply lines became dangerously overextended. Ships carrying provisions and ammunition from Damietta couldn't keep pace with the advancing army. Meanwhile, the Mamluks implemented scorched earth tactics, destroying anything that could sustain the invaders. The result was a starving, exhausted force bogged down in Nile swamps, ravaged by disease. Crusader leadership demonstrated fatal flaws in judgment. Louis IX, despite his piety and personal courage, lacked seasoned military acumen. His delayed decisions and miscalculations of enemy strength cost the campaign dearly. The actions of subordinate commanders like Robert of Artois, who launched an unauthorized attack on Mansurah, transformed a difficult situation into complete catastrophe. Even external factors conspired against the Crusaders. The death of Sultan as-Salih Ayyub in November 1249, which could have crippled Muslim forces, instead became an advantage when his wife Shujar al-Dur concealed his passing, maintaining army morale. Meanwhile, no substantial reinforcements arrived from Europe to rescue the faltering campaign. Mamluk preparations proved the ultimate deciding factor. Before his death, as-Salih Ayyub had transformed Mansurah into an impregnable fortress, exploiting every geographical advantage. The Mamluks he personally trained became perfect war machines, combining strict discipline with exceptional individual combat skills. Their intimate knowledge of the battlefield gave them insurmountable advantages against foreign invaders. Ultimately, Mamluk-ruled Egypt became the graveyard of Crusader ambitions. The crushing defeat at Mansurah and the humiliating capture of King Louis himself brought a tragic end to one of history's largest Crusader armies. The enormous ransom Louis was forced to pay, 400,000 gold coins, equivalent to one-third of France's annual revenue, along with the surrender of Damietta, dealt a devastating blow to Crusader pride. Yet beyond material losses came psychological devastation. The Seventh Crusade proved the regional balance of power had irrevocably shifted. The Crusader states in the Levant could no longer dream of reclaiming Jerusalem, instead fighting merely to preserve their crumbling existence. The Mamluks ascended as the new regional superpower, poised to dominate the Middle East for decades to come. This defeat marked more than a temporary military setback, it signaled the end of an entire Crusader era. Thereafter, Europe proved incapable of mounting comparable large-scale expeditions. The lessons of this catastrophic failure continue to be studied in military academies as cautionary tales about the perils of arrogance, miscalculation, and underestimating one's opponent. The Mamluks' comprehensive victory demonstrated how disciplined forces leveraging terrain advantages and innovative tactics could overcome numerically superior invaders, rewriting the rules of medieval warfare in the process. The relationship between France and the Mamluks underwent a remarkable transformation in the decades following the Seventh Crusade's catastrophic failure, evolving from bitter enmity to a complex interplay of diplomacy and mutual interests. In the immediate aftermath of King Louis IX's humiliating capture and ransom in 1250, one might have expected perpetual hostility between the two powers. Yet history took a different course, as practical considerations gradually overcame the legacy of holy war. The first tentative contacts emerged from the wreckage of military disaster. Louis's release in 1254 had been secured through detailed negotiations that established unexpected channels of communication between the French court and Mamluk Cairo. These early diplomatic exchanges, conducted through intermediaries and translators, revealed surprising common ground. The Mamluks, now firmly established as rulers of Egypt and Syria, demonstrated a pragmatic willingness to engage with their former foes when it served their interests. For their part, the French, though chastened by their crushing defeat, recognized the futility of continued military confrontation and began exploring alternative approaches. As the 13th century progressed, these initial contacts blossomed into more structured relations. French merchants, following in the wake of their Venetian and Genoese rivals, began appearing in Alexandria and Damietta, drawn by the lucrative trade in spices, silks, and other Eastern luxuries. The Mamluks, ever astute commercial operators, welcomed this economic engagement while maintaining strict control over foreign access to their markets. In Paris, royal officials gradually shifted their perspective on the Mamluk regime, no longer viewing it simply as an infidel power to be destroyed, but as a political reality to be managed. The fall of Acre in 1291 marked a watershed in Franco-Mamluk relations. With the last Crusader outposts eliminated, France faced a strategic crossroads. Some hardliners advocated for new military expeditions, but cooler heads prevailed. Instead, French diplomacy intensified its efforts to secure guarantees for Christian holy sites and pilgrims in Palestine. Remarkably, the Mamluk sultans, despite their uncompromising military stance, proved willing to accommodate these religious concerns, recognizing the political and economic benefits of controlled Christian access to Jerusalem. By the 14th century, the relationship had matured into something approaching normal state-to-state interaction. French consular officials took up residence in Alexandria, while Mamluk envoys occasionally appeared at European courts. The 100 Years' War between France and England created new dynamics, as both kingdoms sought to cultivate Mamluk favor for commercial and strategic advantage. The Mamluks, masters of realpolitik, skillfully played these European rivalries to their benefit. Cultural exchanges accompanied these political and economic developments. French scholars and travelers began producing more nuanced accounts of Mamluk society, moving beyond Crusader-era stereotypes. The Sultan's court in Cairo, with its elaborate protocols and ceremonies, fascinated European visitors, even as it reinforced awareness of Mamluk power. At the same time, Arabic works on science and philosophy found their way into French libraries. Transmitted through these renewed contacts, the relationship faced its greatest test with the rise of the Ottoman threat in the 15th century. French kings, recognizing the danger posed by this new Islamic power to the east, briefly entertained hopes of reviving the old Franco-Mamluk connection as a counterweight. However, the final collapse of the Mamluk Sultanate in 1517 rendered such schemes moot, closing an extraordinary chapter in East-West relations that had begun with bitter warfare but ended in reluctant mutual accommodation. Through all these twists and turns, the shadow of the Seventh Crusade loomed large. Louis IX's disastrous campaign had demonstrated the futility of military confrontation with the Mamluks, forcing France to adopt more sophisticated approaches. The Mamluks, for their part, showed remarkable capacity to transform former enemies into diplomatic and commercial partners when it served their interests. This complex dance between two proud civilizations, one emerging from its medieval crusading fervor, the other at the height of its Islamic Renaissance, offers fascinating insights into how historical adversaries can find paths to coexistence. The catastrophic failure of the Seventh Crusade sent shockwaves through medieval society that reverberated for generations, fundamentally altering economic systems and social structures across both Europe and the Islamic world. In France, the immediate aftermath of King Louis IX's humiliating defeat and ransom plunged the kingdom into an unprecedented financial crisis that would reshape its political landscape for decades. The staggering sum of 400,000 gold livres paid for the king's release, equivalent to nearly France's entire annual revenue, drained royal coffers dry, forcing the crown to impose crushing new taxes on an already burdened peasantry. These emergency levies, known as the Crusade tithes, sparked widespread unrest across the French countryside as impoverished farmers saw their meager harvests confiscated by tax collectors, with some regions experiencing open rebellion against the monarchy's demands. The economic devastation extended far beyond royal finances into the very fabric of European commerce. Italian merchant banks that had advanced funds for the crusade faced ruin when their loans went unpaid, triggering a financial contagion that spread through Genoa, Venice, and Florence. Trade routes that had flourished during the Crusader era suddenly collapsed as Mamluk authorities tightened control over Egyptian ports, sending the price of Eastern luxuries, silks, spices, and dyes soaring in European markets. In Marseille and other southern French ports, shipyards stood empty as commercial voyages to the Levant became increasingly perilous, throwing thousands of dockworkers and artisans into poverty. The once thriving fairs of Champagne, where Eastern and Western goods had exchanged hands for centuries, saw their importance dwindle as the flow of Oriental merchandise slowed to a trickle. Socially, the Crusades' failure dealt a mortal blow to the feudal order's military ideology. The myth of invincible Christian knighthood lay shattered on the bloody fields of Mansurah, where heavily armored French nobles had been systematically butchered by Mamluk slave soldiers. Across Europe, young aristocrats who had once dreamed of earning glory and land in holy war now questioned the very foundations of chivalric culture. This crisis of confidence manifested in subtle but profound ways: fewer donations to military orders, declining enthusiasm for crusading vows, and a gradual shift in noble education from purely martial training to include more administrative and diplomatic skills. The Church's authority suffered equally as preachers who had promised divine favor for the Crusades struggled to explain God's apparent abandonment of his warriors, sowing seeds of doubt that would eventually flower into the Protestant Reformation. In Egypt and Syria, the Mamluk victory produced dramatically different but equally transformative social and economic consequences. The slave soldiers who had saved Islam from the Frankish threat were catapulted from servile status to becoming the ruling elite of a new military aristocracy. Vast wealth flowed into Mamluk coffers, not just from Louis's ransom payment but from the systematic looting of Crusader equipment and the seizure of commercial assets in conquered ports. This sudden influx of capital financed an extraordinary building boom across the Mamluk domains, with Sultan Baybars and his successors commissioning magnificent mosques, madrasas, and public works that transformed Cairo into the undisputed cultural capital of the Islamic world. The Kalawan complex, with its monumental hospital serving 4,000 patients daily regardless of religion, stood as physical testament to the new regime's power and prestige. The demographic consequences of the Crusades' failure reshaped both continents. In France, the combination of crushing debt and lost manpower created labor shortages that paradoxically strengthened the bargaining position of surviving peasants and artisans, accelerating the decline of serfdom. Meanwhile, the Mamluks implemented extensive resettlement programs, bringing Turkic and Circassian slave recruits from the Black Sea region to replenish their military ranks while encouraging skilled artisans from across the Islamic world to migrate to their thriving cities. This deliberate multicultural policy created a vibrant urban society in Cairo and Damascus where Greek physicians debated Persian poets and Andalusian architects collaborated with Syrian craftsmen. Perhaps the most profound economic legacy emerged in the Mediterranean's shifting trade patterns. As direct European access to Eastern markets constricted, enterprising merchants began exploring alternative routes, some sailing further west along African coasts, others venturing overland through Mongol territories. These tentative explorations, born of necessity from the Crusades' commercial collapse, would ultimately pave the way for Vasco da Gama's voyage around Africa and Columbus's accidental discovery of the New World. Similarly, the Mamluks' strict control over Red Sea trade forced European manufacturers to develop substitute goods, spurring innovations in textile dyeing, glassmaking and sugar refining that would later fuel Europe's industrial transformation. On a human level, the Crusades' failure left scars that transcended economics. An entire generation of French women found themselves widowed or unmarried due to the catastrophic loss of noble husbands, creating a demographic imbalance that influenced inheritance patterns and family structures for decades. In Islamic lands, the constant influx of slave soldiers created a peculiar social dynamic where rulers were legally property yet wielded absolute power, a paradox that fascinated contemporary observers and continues to puzzle historians today. The environmental impact too was substantial. The scorched earth tactics employed by both sides during the Nile Delta campaigns caused ecological damage that took generations to repair, with some irrigation systems never fully recovering. This man-made environmental degradation ironically contributed to the 14th century's food crises in Egypt, demonstrating how the Crusades' consequences rippled far beyond politics into the very relationship between humans and their habitat. Culturally, the shared trauma of the Crusades' violence produced unexpected cross-fertilization. French prisoners who spent years in Mamluk captivity often returned with surprising appreciation for Arabic language and customs, while Mamluk victors developed a taste for certain Frankish military technologies and fashions. This cultural diffusion, born from conflict's intimate contacts, subtly prepared the ground for more sustained East-West exchange during the Renaissance. As decades passed, the Seventh Crusade social and economic legacy became woven into the fabric of emerging early modern states. In France, the fiscal innovations developed to pay the Crusades' debts evolved into more sophisticated systems of taxation and bureaucracy that strengthened royal authority. In the Mamluk Sultanate, the military slave system perfected after Mansurah created a remarkably stable regime that would dominate the region for centuries. Both developments, ironically, stemmed from what contemporaries had viewed as unmitigated disaster, proving how history's most transformative consequences often emerge from apparent failures rather than victories.